Prior to joining the State Department, he served for over 20 years in the U.S. Navy as a surface warfare officer, retiring as commander in 2020. He received a bachelor's degree in American Studies from the George Washington University in 2001, and a master's degree in National Security and Strategic Studies from the Naval War College in 2012. Jeff is a great partner to IGMAP. We've been very fortunate and happy to have had him come here last year for our conference. He's been, some of you might remember that he's also, I think twice now, been one of our expert advisors for our Atrocity Intervention exercise, which we do every year. More on that later. If you want to get on our IGMAT mailing list and get notifications for upcoming events that you can participate in, you can shoot an email to that effect at igmat@binghamton.edu, and we will add you. And you can get a heads up to who's coming and when we're coming and what the next events are on the calendar. Jeff is the last of this semester's visiting practitioners. These are folks who we bring, non-academic people who are deeply engaged in atrocity prevention practice in all kinds of different organizations and agencies all around the world. We bring 3 per semester to Binghamton. They do this. They come visit your classes. They are around for coffees and bring Jeff's teas. So if you check our website at IGMAP at Binghamton, you will also soon be getting information on next semester's visiting practitioners. We'd love to have you come and spend time with them next semester as well. Jeff's going to talk to us about atrocity prevention and practice, all hands on deck. Very apt metaphor for a sailor. So please join me in welcoming Jeff Sizemore.
Thank you to the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention in Binghamton for inviting me to join you all this week. Thanks especially to Dr. Max Spensky and Dr. Carrie Wiggum, who I had the distinct pleasure of working with for quite some time now, and to Dr. Sarah Snyder and Amanda Nichols for doing the incredible lifting and organizing and making this so effortless and so easy to be out here. So thank you so much for organizing this. I am honored to be here with you all and joining you this afternoon. As Max said, the title of my talk this evening is on all hands on deck. And it's recognizing that if we are actually going to move the needle on preventing atrocities, it can't just be a United States government activity. It can't just be the State Department. It can't just be us alone. We have to work with, and honestly, we have to rely on our colleagues across the interagency, across civil society, across academia, and across the multilateral and international system. As Max said, I am Jeff Sizemore, and I am the Senior Advisor on Atrocity Prevention in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the United States Department of State. My Bureau's work grapples with promoting and harnessing the opportunities for greater prosperity and well-being across the globe, also ensuring that we as the United States government responds to the needs of the world's most vulnerable people during their darkest times. I'm so grateful to work with my colleagues, both across the functional and regional offices inside the Bureau, who are working honestly daily and tirelessly to improve the lives of people globally and improve the human rights situation in any way that they can. I will begin by noting our strong belief as United States government that atrocity prevention goals are within our national interest. We've emphasized this with the passing of the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act and stated as such in our national security strategy. Exactly how to operationalize these goals is sort of the rub. That's where we face the challenges, and how do we actually operationalize that? To this effect, mass atrocities and how we respond remains a key concern. Accepting that United States policy and the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act make clear that atrocity prevention is critical to United States national interests, so we're talking about why. Atrocities endanger international peace, they endanger stability, they endanger prosperity, they threaten the rules-based international order, and honestly, atrocity prevention is a moral imperative. It's the right thing to do, and as someone who has the sole focus of that, it's pretty easy to understand why I do what I do. Sadly, the examples of where this work is needed are far too easy to name. We remain horrified by President Vladimir Putin's premeditated and unprovoked war against Ukraine. We strongly condemn the atrocities committed by Russia's forces across Ukraine, and we are supporting all international efforts to pursue accountability for their war crimes and other atrocities committed, including conflict-related sexual violence, which we are seeing in great numbers. Unfortunately, of course, this is not the only area where we've seen atrocities committed. The 2022 Elie Wiesel report addresses these and other atrocities, including in Afghanistan, Burma, Ethiopia, the People's Republic of China, South Sudan, and Sudan. And that's not the only ones listed. The report also highlights the efforts to address the risk of atrocities and to strengthen countries' efforts to protect their populations from atrocities. Because ideally, every state would take under the responsibility to protect their own responsibility to protect their populations. From the Elie Wiesel Act, it states that we're going to pursue a strategy to pursue atrocity prevention as a government. Well, we went and wrote it. And so the United States strategy to anticipate, prevent, and respond to atrocities was released this July. And it's the next step in the United States government to implement the Elie Wiesel Act and further institutionalize the processes regarding atrocity prevention and response. This means we're trying to better align and coordinate our efforts in a whole-of-government approach. And I really mean whole of government, as the strategy is not a State Department document or a USAID document, but an actual interagency product that has the support and buy-in from the various departments and agencies across the whole of government. And so that it is a whole of government approach to disrupt the processes that lead to atrocities, as well as assist countries in their efforts to protect their populations from the threat of atrocity and to respond to crimes in a survivor-centered and trauma-informed way once they occur. The Atrocity Prevention Task Force, which is well out in the strategy, remains in place, and it is the sort of follow-on agency, follow-on body to all the work that was done under the Atrocity Prevention Board and the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force, which predates the current task force. This is a body composed of members of departments and agencies across the U.S. government, each with a unique set of diplomatic, assistance, economic, defense, and other tools which can be leveraged towards the purpose of preventing atrocities and mitigating human suffering. In the State Department, my colleagues in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization are doing amazing work in improving early warning, improving our analytic abilities, and acting as the secretariat for the task force and for the Global Fragility Act. The Office of Global Criminal Justice is leading on accountability, transitional justice, and supporting work globally to stop impunity. The Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues is a critical partner in ensuring that we are approaching atrocity prevention with a gendered lens and addressing the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence, which is an atrocity in and of itself and absolutely an indicator of likely future atrocities. Many of my colleagues are in London this week as we speak, carrying this message at the Prevention of Sexual Violence and Conflict Conference, which is being hosted by the United Kingdom, where the United States is announcing new efforts to seek accountability for conflict-related sexual violence, and we in DRL are going to be pursuing a program in support of that. My colleagues in the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau are training security and law enforcement services globally and trying to make sure that security forces are the guarantors of security and that they fight atrocity risk instead of being the source of risk and perpetrators themselves. These are just a few of the examples from so many of my colleagues across the department, to say nothing of the desk officers, regional colleagues, and other functional folks that are doing atrocity prevention on a daily basis, oftentimes not under the specific moniker of atrocity prevention, but the work they're doing is addressing atrocity risk. If all we're thinking about is a binary, did an atrocity happen, yes, no, the numbers aren't going to be terribly great. But what we're trying to do is address risk, and in any way we can, as we drive that risk lower, we increase our resiliency, we give ourselves greater bandwidth, and we buy ourselves space to operate. Across the interagency, USAID is a partner every step of the way, bringing to bear massive resources to address and improve lives. I will be traveling with USAID colleagues next week as we head out to do training and to meet with survivors, with civil society, and with government colleagues in areas of concern. Colleagues in the Department of Justice and the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, Treasury, the Department of Defense, the Office of Budget and Management, there are smart, caring, dedicated folks putting the work in to try and collectively meet the massive, knotty, difficult, complex challenges of addressing atrocity risk and drive towards a better solution. Many atrocities are a result of deliberate planning over time, and if you believe that, then you believe that they can be avoided. that it is an institutional issue that we can address and that we can work towards. If we detect the early warning signs of atrocities, we can then work to address their causes and disrupt the path of often deadly escalation. The idea being, early warning leads to early action, provided we take the action. Components of the strategy have existed for quite some time, but this marks the first time that the United States has a public and comprehensive strategy that we have shared globally. It releases the transparency that Americans should expect of their government in addressing today's challenges, and thankfully acts as a model for like-minded partners that might want to emulate in their own domestic contexts. And though the well-established Atrocities and Gender Prevention Act, the Global Fragility Act, the Women, Peace and Security Act, we have in the United States government a sort of framework of really mutually supportive and mutually enhancing authorities and obligations. And that's the important part. We have an obligation to do this work, to drive and support our work in these areas. My job specifically exists because there is a requirement to do training and a requirement to do atrocity prevention. The reason my position is funded is because of that. And so these laws give us the space, give us the political will to enact these processes. We are a few years into the implementation of a few of these laws, the Women, Peace and Security Act and the LOSL Act, and still a bit nascent in the implementation of the Global Fragility Act. But the research, the advocacy, and the lesson learned in all these areas has been around for quite some time. This research has been done for a while, some by some of our dear colleagues. And yet a lot of work remains to done to transform this knowledge into a clear and meaningful action, so that it's not just talk, but it's actually tangible work going forward. And so that our genocide prevention speaks louder than the words on the paper themselves. We also have the benefit of 10 years of lessons learned to continue to improve how we in the United States government work these issues. And there's a recognition that measurement, learning, and knowledge is important, with that feedback loop being critical. That not only should we be doing this, but we should be doing it as smartly and as efficiently as we can. And if we're not asking the hard questions of how we could have done it better, we are absolutely missing that opportunity. Much of this year has been taken up with responding to a number of crises around the globe, many of which I've already mentioned and which you can see on the front page of the Post or the Times. But one of the focuses of the strategy is driving towards a focus on response, when it is actually, or on a focus on prevention, when we still have the ability to save lives, so that we are not only doing response. We need to do better on prevention, and that's certainly something that we are driving towards. Analyses and risk assessments are important tools to ensure our atrocity prevention experts have a voice at the policymaking table early on, when we see the early warning supplies and we deploy the toolkit that we have available. When you get into the response phase, the toolkit gets pretty narrow, and you just don't have the options available. And so not only is prevention good from a moral perspective, because people aren't passing away, but it gives us so many more options in sort of how to respond. And so we continue as a task force to look at where prevention is possible and to drive ourselves left on the timeline. We released the United States strategy to anticipate, prevent, and respond to atrocity strategy this year as a signal of our commitment. While the task force provides real-time support to respond to ongoing crises, we're committing to focusing on the prevention agenda. This is not only good for preventing human suffering and casualties, but as you all know, it also enhances global security, and it's in our own national security interest. And it's honestly just good economically as well. It's cheaper to do prevention than it is to do response, and so there's a good business case for that alone, to say nothing of the moral imperative. Sharing this strategy publicly and issuing the congressional required yearly report to Congress is one way to hold ourselves accountable and to ensure that we learn from our experiences, even when they're painful, sobering, bruising, and to make sure we institutionalize what works. As I've said, atrocity prevention is not just a United States government activity alone, and as I said, with the title of All Hands on Deck, we expect that the strategy informs our engagement with our partners and allies. With them, and in multilateral fora, the idea is to advance frameworks and discussion leading to collective international solutions. I quote from the strategy: "The task force will strive for consultative, coordinated, and transparent activities to prevent, respond to, and foster recovery from atrocities, including strategic public messaging. The United States government will invite collaboration with a wide range of stakeholders, including UN agencies, regional organizations, partner governments, local populations, and civil society and related consortia." Why am I here? specifically because of that, because of the recognition that we as the government cannot do this if we're not reaching out to the centers of excellence and the centers of thought. This means that regular meetings with and consultation with IGMAP, with the Protection and Prevention Working Group, with the Protection Approaches, with the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, with the Atrocity Prevention Study Group, with the United States Institute of Peace, with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, with the Global Center on the Responsibility to Protect, with the European Center on the Responsibility to Protect, and a further and increasing constellation and web of organizations, all with the same aim of trying to address atrocity risk is not just a good idea, and one that I would partake anyway, but is now specifically called out as my responsibility and a clear directive in our strategy. This means that meeting with like-minded nations and with entities at the UN, including the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide and the Special Advisor on the Responsibility to Protect and their offices, is again not just a good idea and a good practice, but are mandated activities. Clearly stating, clearly articulating, and clearly codifying this in the strategy and in the Elie Wiesel Act makes things very simple for me because it means that good practices are now part of my job. All hands on deck indeed. Speaking of clearly articulated requirements, the Elie Wiesel Act obligates actors across the United States government in an office in Washington or in an office in one of over 300 diplomatic missions worldwide to be trained on how to identify and work towards addressing and reducing atrocity risk. We have dedicated and continue to dedicate considerable resources to training on atrocity prevention. Our Foreign Service officers are trained to raise the alarm when they see troubling warning signs. You can't do early action if you don't have the early warning, and folks at post are going to be that first folks to notice and be able to raise the alarm. All of our staff must be empowered to do so, and it's our responsibility in Washington to hear them and to act on the information before it is too late to save lives. It is a whole of government effort that is not meant to be siloed as an initiative that is unrelated to everything else that we do or care about. Bureaucratically, this is not always easy, but it's imperative that we make progress in how we do this. Acting early is our best chance at preventing human suffering and stemming further instability. We must hold ourselves accountable to this standard. I was able to lead a training this summer that was attended by members from across the interagency, where we were able to share best practices, to discuss what special skills and resources and opportunities we each bring to the table, and to really think about how to leverage our specific collective skills and areas of expertise to make us as efficient and as effective as we can be. Training is not just a United States effort alone. This morning, sitting in my hotel before coming over, I was able to host a training session with like-minded government partners and colleagues from multiple nations, where we were able to talk about early warning and what the risk factors are to look for. This was number 3 and 5 setting of trying to, let's not just share our learning internally, but share it as externally as much as we possibly can. As we believe and as stated in our strategy that this work must be inclusive and not just a United States effort alone, why would we not be training together if we have the opportunity? Training remains a really easy way to commence challenging conversations about atrocity risk. No one is opposed to training. We're just talking about training. And so once you've started that conversation, it's so much easier to address the hard topics and calling out issues and risks where we see them. And so I'm happy to be the Trojan horse that gets us into the room to sort of have that conversation as we go forward. Moving from sort of the macro and kind of the broad view and discussing where we are collectively coming together to address atrocity risk, I will conclude with a little bit more of a micro discussion about where my bureau is doing real, concrete, tangible work, and to give some examples of how prevention is actually happening in real time. I believe that we all have to be working together and we all have to be doing our part, and I'd like to tell you a bit about how democracy, human rights, and labor is actually accomplishing prevention. The Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor is one of the primary United States government entities that funds and supports atrocity prevention programming. Often this programming seeks to bolster the self-protection and resilient capabilities of vulnerable groups, to mitigate atrocity risk factors, and deter potential perpetrators. Community-based early warning, early response systems are one method that, when properly deployed and designed and implemented, meet those atrocity prevention objectives. There are other programs where we support in the atrocity prevention space as well, which includes breaking the cycle of impunity that drives atrocities and involve utilizing innovative technologies and approaches, including documentation, radio work, and ensuring that communities have the ability to protect themselves. We fund atrocity prevention globally and have a mandate to do so. In this programming space, we're often working with limited funding and resources and in difficult and insecure environments. But honestly, that's what makes this, I think, most effective because of the grassroots nature and the fact that we in DRL are working with civil society directly. And so that we are ensuring that it's going to those most at need at the point where the atrocity risk is most acute. It's critical in these circumstances to find a way to maximize our impact and ensure that what we support is not only effective, but also sustainably and locally owned, and to do the work in a way that does not cause an additional harm, and that we adhere to the do no harm principle. DRL has long invested in programming for atrocity prevention goals. We've seen successes, particularly in our strategic approach to meet communities where they are, to build on their existing resiliencies and provide modest support that bolsters their ability to protect themselves. We're grateful to work with partners who have the unique combined skill sets in the areas of peace building, security, human rights, atrocity prevention, and transitional justice. We've been able to develop tailored, locally owned, and grassroots approaches to atrocity prevention in the regions in which we work. This approach aligns with DRL's belief that effective atrocity prevention must be rooted in the empowerment of those impacted and incorporate both a horizontal and vertical component, meaning that the communities communicate horizontally with each other and vertically with potential responders, and that lessons learned and feedback is shared across the different implementers so that we are all collectively learning together. I want to get in detail on one form of atrocity prevention in particular, as those the early warning systems. What makes these programs so strong and effective is that they address not only the practicality of early warning, but also underlying drivers of atrocity risk through results such as mediation, social cohesion, and building bonds in those communities. Moreover, these programs incorporate concerted sustainability approaches so that when the program ends, the benefits don't cease with the end of the program. Income generating activities is obviously one of the great sort of sustainabilities. And also making sure that we are addressing psychosocial support and so that we are taking care of the whole problem and not just addressing single symptoms. Additionally, we've seen that early warning systems are a cost-effective and grassroots way to lead communities remain safe and secure, especially in rural areas where state-led protection resources are either non-existent or extremely limited. We're grateful for our partners' efforts in their spaces and their ongoing resolve to improve the effectiveness of these early warning systems, often at their own jeopardy. This is critical work that is incredibly important and valuable as current events show daily. To zoom out again here at the close more broadly, while we continue to see progress globally across a number of development indicators, we also continue to see massive human suffering and its destabilizing efforts across different settings, much of it man-made and preventable. A number of converging global pressures and trends remind us of the need to elevate the importance of this work, how we view atrocity prevention and approach the peace and security challenges of our time. This includes defending democracy and advancing human rights, amplifying the voices of women leaders in all of their roles, tackling the climate crisis, and rebuilding our alliances and multilateral institutions for shared action. We must be all hands. And it's a recognition that these are essential and central to America's enduring security and prosperity. So what does this all mean for treating the risks of mass atrocities and acting to prevent them while addressing the same challenges? It means we're working to weave together the links between democracy, state fragility, atrocity prevention, along with these emerging challenges. Democratic values and institutions offer the best inoculation against atrocities worldwide, which is what our Bureau and our belief is founded upon. Finally, we must continue to seek justice when prevention fails and mass atrocities take place. Ending impunity for the worst violations of human rights and atrocities is indispensable, not only to promote peace and security, but also as a key tool of prevention itself and the right thing to do so that the worst of humanity are not allowed to operate with impunity. Thank you all so very much for your time, and now I'll open the floor up to questions and conversation. Please.
Just want to say thank you you mentioned how you had, meetings with international organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and you also mentioned how early warning systems have been incredibly helpful when impacting, communities that are at risk. I was wondering, in the realm of efficiency, is there some sort of unified database that you all enter your information so you don't have to constantly, find a time to meet, discuss it all, and rather have that all that information can happen in one sort of space?
So, multilaterally, not that I know of. we share information as much as we possibly can, and I have been really impressed and honestly a little bit surprised at our willingness as the United States to share information, especially of late. Some folks have done some really kind of, I think, impressive work to overcome some of the challenges in sharing of information. I mean, obviously classification is something that has to be worked through and it shouldn't be ignored, but it's something that can be worked through. And you can and find a way to get to a point where we can share that information. And as the strategy states, we're going to do this kind of together. Well, why wouldn't we share the good stuff we know so that we make our friends effective also? And so that's been kind of a point. As far as a central database, as far as a central repository, it doesn't exist. And there's always sort of an interesting question when you start to have a whole bunch of information in one place. How would that be exploited? And how would that be used by those that are a bit more malicious? And so I think there is some obvious concerns about having too much in one place, especially when you're dealing with vulnerable populations, if you're dealing with any kinds of testimony or folks speaking out against perpetrators that might continue to still be there and be in power. Making sure that we're being protective is super important. You know, as we do the early morning projects inside of DRL, we are incredibly careful in not talking about who our implementers are specifically and not talking about specific country contexts for fear of putting them in harm's way more than they are already. And so I never want to be the person that, while bragging about what we're doing, inadvertently sets somebody else up for danger or being in harm's way. So we're trying to get better at sharing information. I don't know if the central repository is necessarily the perfect answer. It's not necessarily not, but it's just not something that exists currently, and it's a bit more ad hoc as we go. Please.
So I'm not an IG math student, I'm more on the philosophy, political science end of the humanities spectrum. But this past semester I've been studying the rise of populism and populist rhetoric across the globe in Italy, Brazil, Russia certainly, what have you. And so it's also prevalent in the United States given election denying and having that increasing sustainability happening once in a while. And so I'm curious if that rise in populist rhetoric globally is something that you take into consideration, evaluating traits that you see for preventative tactics.
Hate speech, dangerous speech, violent rhetoric that leads to incitement of violence is one of the giant, massive red flags as far as atrocity goes. And so it is something we are absolutely aware of. It is something we are thinking about. We have done programs to work on specifically addressing and to promoting voices in opposition, to promoting voices that are looking towards cohesion. It is something that is incredibly difficult, and I would say that the prevalence and spread of social media networks makes the ability for those messages to filter out faster, quicker, harder to locate, harder to address. Where you have necessarily that, maybe that's not even coming from inside of the community that's being affected. It can be sort of placed from other malign actors that are looking externally, that are trying to exacerbate situations and to increase the risk and to drive things more difficultly. There's not a great answer yet, but it's certainly something that we're thinking about and certainly something that we continue to sort of drive forward. Understanding that we also believe in free speech, that we're not looking to sort of curtail that, but instead to find out other messaging to sort of counter it. But I would say that rhetoric is certainly something that is a major concern for thinking about atrocity risk and increasing likelihood of violence, and especially when it starts to become dehumanizing. Please.
So I was in my class, we were just out and Stephen. So you spoke a little bit about the lack of immediacy of international courts in your talk with our class. I worked, before I came here, I worked as an English teacher in Ukraine for a bit. So I have my ear to the ground to sort of like what my students, what my former colleagues are saying. And there's this lack of trust, this lack of faith in sort of this international attempt to curtail genocide because their country is currently facing this genocide. How do you respond to that sort of thing? How do you, I had it perfectly worded in my head until I had to say these words.
Don't worry,
But-
I'm gonna have to do the answer, so.
But how do you is it an anxiety of yours that the lack of immediacy of sort of these international efforts might curtail faith in the work that you're doing? How do you combat that?
Sure. I mean, I want it faster. I want it better. I want it to work seamlessly, and I want it to work quick. That's not the way it works. And honestly, you can get some bad verdicts when things move too fast. These are massive, important investigations where you are holding individuals accountability. And so it needs to be right. And it needs to be right more than it needs to be fast. And it needs to be comprehensive. And it needs to hold those accountable. Ideally, in my perfect world, each state would hold these individuals accountable themselves. I would love for the ICC to be superfluous. I would love for the international mechanisms not to be required. I would love for each nation to have the means and wherewithal to hold perpetrators accountable themselves and to do their own protection and to go after those that commit these awful crimes on their grounds internally. The reasons why the international mechanisms exist is because that domestic prosecution is not always possible, and that collectively as a group we recognize, well, we need something else because these most heinous of crimes, these most awful of the things humans do to one another, we can't in good moral standing allow that to occur without addressing. And so we chose mechanisms which are imperfect. And you have mechanisms where there isn't a single entity that sort of controls. And so those that don't want to see things move forward in a multilateral system can be impediments to success. There are many who would like to see these fail to prove, well, this isn't even worth doing. Look how slow it is. I would argue, well, it's still moving, it's still working, it's still going forward. We are still seeing convictions, even if it's after the fact. That's justice at some point. And so for me, I'll take an imperfect solution that eventually gets us to where we go, better than nothing at all. And I know that it's not the best possible, but it's what we have, and that's better than nothing. That's better than turning a blind eye. That's better than ignoring. That's better than allowing perpetrators to operate with impunity with no fear. I mean, I heard anecdotally recently where some folks were talking to some folks on the ground in an Africa context, and someone actually asked the question, what is this ICC? Which meant that that had gotten around and that they knew that there was actually somewhere, something out there that if things went awful, they would face repercussions. That to me is a win. That to me is a absolute indication of holding folks accountable, being part of prevention, being you don't want to do this because eventually they might come looking for you and they might hold you accountable. That threat, that possibility works towards ending the cycle and stopping that you don't have recurrence. And so I don't in any way argue that these institutions and organizations are without things that are able to be critiqued. But it's better than nothing, and I'm willing to believe in that. And if you never saw results, then I think that would, but that's not the case. Convictions do happen. Individuals are held to account under these auspices, and so we have examples where there's been success. And so I'll take the best that we got solution over nothing at all. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ilana. I am a senior studying political science. So last year I interned at a local Binghamton immigration and refugee nonprofit organization, and this was right after the U.S. evacuation from Afghanistan. And so we were doing quite a lot of sort of refugee applications and sponsorships and things like that. And I know that this is much more on the response side than the prevention side, but I was wondering if your office works with USCIS to help refugees and victims of mass atrocities gain refugee and entry into the United States, because the process, from what I've seen, is very, very long, and I know that specifically with Afghanistan, there was an incredible amount of backlog in the system.
So the bureau that works on that inside this Department of State is the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And I worked with them during that time in the evacuation of Afghanistan and got to see the incredible work that they were doing under truly incredibly difficult circumstances. And yeah, the process is long. It's not as fast as they want, and we probably need, more people and more resources, as is always the case. That is not an area that I work on generally. My focus is always external, and that ends up in some ways as a bit more of a domestic sort of consideration, and that doesn't sort of fall specifically under my edict. But looking at internally displaced peoples, looking at refugees, looking at refugee flows is always a area of focus and an area of looking for atrocity risk and how those that are moving are being treated and being protected is incredibly important. Is often individuals at their most vulnerable, and so most at risk specifically for predators, gender-based violence amongst flows of refugees is alarmingly high and terrifyingly so. And so we've done some work with the UN to try to figure out how to address that better and to make sure that when you are setting up systems to protect individuals that are running for their lives, you're not going from one trouble to something else, that it is actually a safe place and that individuals are protected, and that's something that we've been looking at. So that is not my personal area of expertise, and so I am aware of, but can't speak to any more detail. You had your hand raised?
Hi, I'm also from the class who just spoke back. My name is Ashley. I'm really interested in different forms of justice, and you mentioned transitional justice. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about its role in the justice.
Thank you. Excellent question, and one that I didn't know about until coming to the State Department. And talking to my colleagues that sort of work on justice all the time, the idea is full spectrum. And so that it's both restorative and retributive. And so that you're seeking accountability for those that are most responsible for the crimes, but you're also doing the taking care of survivors, making sure that they get the support that they need, and making sure that justice is what actually they want. I know what I think justice is, but that's from my cultural upbringing, that's from my perspective. Justice might look incredibly different. Maybe justice is memorialization. Maybe justice is truth-telling. Maybe it's taking the perpetrators and making them come back to their communities and apologize. Maybe it is actually criminal accountability and that's what's needed and desired. That's okay. Maybe it has nothing to do with the perpetrators whatsoever, and it's only about building up the survivors and getting them their lives back, providing them their livelihoods again, meeting what they need. And nothing about us without us is a really good phrase where we're not going to dictate from Washington, D.C. what the answer is for a community that we're not in. We want to facilitate, we want to partner, we want to work with, but I can almost guarantee we will fail if we're doing it without the input of those that we're involved with. And so that means you have to go ask the question. We're working on some programs and plans to do some surveys in places that are now post-violence, but pre-justice. And instead of just sort of stumbling in, what if we went and talked to people and asked them and gave them a menu of what this might look like in other contexts and see what strikes a chord with them. And so a clear understanding of we have to do it with those folks that are involved and protected, and that we need to make sure that not only are they being consulted, but that they're leading and that they have ownership of these processes is incredibly important. to simply determine, to dictate, to drive, not a good way to go, and certainly guaranteed to fail, as well as just being sort of incredibly heavy-handed and awful and not to be pursued. And so my colleagues in our transitional justice team and my colleagues in our Office of Global Criminal Justice absolutely trying to think through how to provide justice for the community that needs it in a means that is meaningful and healing for them. If memorialization or a plaque or a site of conscience is going to help heal that community, great. If it's not, and it's actually going to further exacerbate the tensions already there, let's not do that. And so justice is not just someone going to jail. It's much broader than that, and it should answer what the community needs at that time.
Yeah, I was wondering if you find that the work that your office does and the work of mass atrocity prevention ever comes into conflict with some of like the broader objectives of the State Department, like U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so I get to talk to colleagues kind of across the department, and if you are a desk officer and it is your responsibility to manage the bilateral relationship with a given country, my human rights concerns and my atrocity prevention concerns are not the only thing that is your responsibility. They have to think about the bilateral relationship, the strategic relationship, economic relationship, security cooperation, counterterrorism, business, a host of things. And that is their job. They are required, if they're doing their job well, to think about it in a broader sense. My job is very simple. I'm the atrocity prevention guy. It's the only thing I have to think about. It's the only thing I have to push. It's the only thing that I have to advocate for. It's incredibly narrow. It's really nice for me. It makes it very clear. I know what I'm supposed to do each day. I know what it is I'm supposed to advocate for. I don't envy them the balancing act that they have to do. I don't actually expect that I'm going to be the only voice they listen to or the only voice that they want to hear. I would think absolutely I'm a voice, and that's what I want to make sure. I want to make sure that I'm in the room. I want to make sure that my colleagues that are sort of advocating for human rights, for democracy, for these things, we get a seat at the table so that we are able to advocate for it. And then ultimately, we will make a decision that is right for the United States. We will make a decision that is right for our overarching aims. I don't make policy for the whole USG. I make policy for a tiny, tiny little slice. And I recognize that. I just want to make sure that I'm part of that conversation and that I'm one of the considerations as they're thinking through. As you're thinking about the relationship, atrocity risk is something that we have stated we care about. We have said this is in our national security interest. And so make sure that you've given me the call and you told me when the meeting is, and I'll come over and I'll come have that conversation, and I'll be prepared to give you kind of the examples you're looking for. But yeah, sometimes it is intention because I'm not the only game in town and I'm not the only thing that folks are thinking about. Please.
So I recently did work with an organization called 93 in England, which works to end violence and discrimination in various countries. And some of the countries were India, Jamaica, and Uganda. And when we were working with them, we got a lot of pushback sometimes in terms of the policies we wanted them to sort of implement to help women's rights. And the issue was that we were saying that we had good success at prevention in terms of violence of different natures in other countries that we were working with. And they would ask us in response, well, how are you measuring prevention? Because you can't measure something that doesn't happen. And when we would say, well, the rate of violence has gone down, they would say, well, that depends on self-reporting and the vertical and horizontal reporting from various, both the victims and perpetrators and the people who are supposed to be protecting the communities. So I'm wondering, how do you, when you're dealing with countries that may be reluctant to change policy or may just be finding it difficult to change policy, how do you measure prevention or the strength of a tool that you use, or how do you convince them that it will actually work?
So, great. A regular conversation and a regular concern, something that I face all the time. as I think I said previously, if my batting averages did or did not something happen, number one, the batting average is pretty bad, and that's not necessarily what I think we should be measured on. What I do know, and this is through the work of IGMAP and through the work of a lot of other scholars, is we have a historical record of where we've seen, we know if you have huge flows of population, your atrocity risk goes up. We know that if literacy is really, really low, your atrocity risk goes up. There are quite a multitude of factors that I can show you that when those factors are in place, your risk goes up or down. And so I'm not trying necessarily to only just prevent atrocities. What I'm trying to do is reduce risk. And so what I can show you is, I know definitively that this factor has a causal relationship with atrocity risk. So I'm not going to tell you that I'm stopping atrocities. What I'm telling you is, I can show you definitively that we now have 40% more women's involvement in peace processes. And I know that that has a follow-on effect in reducing risk. I know that we've addressed child and infant mortality, and we've done it by this percentage. And I can give you that number, and I know that that relates to atrocity risk. And so, rather than framing it as, tell me that you have or haven't prevented, I can't do that today. What I can tell you is, amongst these factors, which we have a good historical record, I can show you where we fixed some of those things and improved those conditions, which then leads to less risk, greater resiliency, lower likelihood of something happening or sort of starting off, or if something does happen, it reduces the scale and mitigates the results. You said you were working in the UK. The Foreign Commonwealth Office just released something called What Works, where they actually went and did some really good analytical work, specifically on kind of answering this question and coming up with factors and coming up with answers. And instead of making it a FCDO product, they made it for the common good, and they are freely releasing it, recognizing we are all better served by that. They didn't have to do that. That was an incredibly generous and I think actually a global gift as far as providing that information, because we're all trying to make sure we're doing it better, smarter, faster. And all of us have limited resources, and we have to explain why we use the resources we did and how we did it. I am a taxpayer paid, and all of the assistance we give comes out of taxpayers. I have to be a good steward of that money, and so me being able to articulate and explain why we've done what we've done, why we've gone where we've gone, why it is of actual value, that's a responsibility. And the ability to tell that story in a way that is understood and compelling is important to us and to partners abroad who might be concerned or reticent or doubtful of a given course of action. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Please. Thank you very much. My name is Marcus. I'm a student in Fragility. I'm also writing or doing research on memorials in Rwanda. One of the findings we have seen is the importance of culture and memory, and how not knowing the culture and how the memory is built has caused a lot of issues, especially for survivors, because the way they communicate emotions, it also comes from culture. So sometimes people from institutions, from research perspective, may not understand that, and that complicates or creates some issues, different levels.
Absolutely.
And then my question is, in your study you mentioned, have you encountered something like that, cultural building? Or are you also planning to use institutions like IGMA for student exchange to make sure that in future prevention there is also that cultural awareness and the diversity, especially around the world? My last question would be about the UN Progressive Group as establishing new office. How are we planning to work with our office to make sure that people are here?
So we have just, I think, hired a new youth person inside the State Department recently, specifically recognizing that was an area. I'll answer the last part first and then go to the other question. we know it's an area that we weren't necessarily in a position, and so we are filling that ourselves. In my office, we have a senior advisor on children in armed conflict, whose job it is to specifically look at child soldiers, at how trauma affects children in conflict and things like that. And so we now have a person who has an edict and a responsibility to go forth and sort of do that, recognizing that we were not paying as much attention to that as we probably needed to, and are addressing accordingly. So the fact that they're standing up people, we're doing the same thing in real time, and I think it's a recognition of that needs more addressing and needs more attention. As far as the cultural significance, absolutely. I had a bunch of conversations with colleagues in IGMAP. Sakat recently has had a few conversations with my office specifically on how to do decolonialization of transitional justice and of these activities, recognizing that we cannot assume we understand how it's going to work, and that I think a lot of the reason why, in answer to your question previously, and thinking through how to go about doing surveys and stuff like that, is a recognition of, if we just sort of stumble in and say, well, this is the memorialization, and you'll put a plaque here and you'll do that there and it's going to fix everything, it's not going to work. It's insensitive, it's culturally abusive, and is not helpful. And so having the humility, having the recognition that we don't have the answer and that we need to do the listening and the work. DRL, because of the nature that we are not allowed to fund any government organizations, we have to work with civil society. We end up inside the State Department as sort of the civil society sort of part of the State Department. And so it's incredibly natural for us to talk to experts, to talk to the folks on the ground, to talk to folks in the field. That is what we do. And so what you're espousing and suggesting is, I think, actually built into what we are. And then we have to be the mouthpiece for that across the Bureau and across the interagency, and make sure that that's clear. But amongst my colleagues, what you were saying as far as understanding the cultural significance, that is something we understand completely and recognize that we don't have the answers and that we have to be asking the right questions and listening and not being driving it, but being facilitating, so that those are led by the locals that are affected, that understand what actually justice, what memorialization, what emotional response, what trauma, what the recovery from that actually means. Because if not, we're missing out. You bet your hand.
Yeah. So the last practitioner, Kate Ferguson, spent a lot of time talking about the future of global atrocity prevention, and she raised the issue of the relationship between climate change and mass atrocities. And I know, like off the top of my head, one variable that caused conflict in Syria was the drought that forced farmers to move to cities, which had sparked the civil war. And I guess I have two questions. One is, are there any examples of this relationship you've worked with, like, between climate and the environment, climate and atrocities you've worked with, you think of, and in your department, is there any interest in the role of environment or climate change and its connections?
Yep. I have a colleague who I had a conversation with like a month ago, who is basically writing up some stuff to figure out how to align messaging and atrocity prevention and climate in real time. It's happening now. As far as examples, absolutely. If you look at farmer-herder conflicts, which often happen especially in areas of the Sahel, that's driven by encroachment, by reduced growing areas, by that instability. And you have two different groups that are trying to simply exist and to meet their economic needs and to do the feeding of their population, where climate change is exacerbating that condition and making it worse. I cannot think of a condition or an instance where climate change is helping. It is taking what are charged situations and making them more difficult. A global pandemic, and then the subsequent loss of food and the food insecurity, and guess what that also does? It makes atrocity risk worse. The economic fallout from the global economy stopping for about a year or so makes things worse. There's not actually a whole lot of great news stories on the areas where I look and where I'm concerned, because the global pressures have happened a lot in the last 2 years, and climate change is only going to be getting worse and further exacerbated, and it's going to touch everything. I don't think we understand yet what the scope and scale is going to be, but the amount of migration that's going to happen and what that's going to do as far as a driver of atrocity risk is going to be massive. And you know, we had folks talking about fragility and talking about atrocity risk during the most recent COP27, recognizing that climate and these risks are intimately tied and have to be addressed. I don't have the Wonka golden ticket that sort of tells you what the answer is going to be or how that's going to shake out, but it's certainly not for lack of awareness and not for paying attention. We are acutely aware of how bad it can and might be, and are trying to think about what are the steps, what are the mitigating factors to sort of answer that in real time.
You mentioned about training,
Training?
and I was wondering if it's like kind of awareness making or kind of practical training, who are the beneficiaries of that training, and what's the content of the training about prevention, that's one, and also I would love to hear from you, like how do United States look at the ability of vulnerable communities in the
So the second one's pretty, actually, I think, easier for me to answer because I work at the State Department. And so my responsibility is to look abroad. I am aware of the issues domestically because I read the news and because I think about things. And you can't have sort of looked at where atrocity risk lies, at what the risk factors are, at what the risks might be, and what the pathways might be, and not see the news of what is happening in the United States and see, well, I recognize that. I recognize that. And that's going the way that, and so amongst the community of folks that sort of look abroad, there's an understanding that there is risk internally. And I think we are understanding that the President and the Secretary of State have said, when we advocate this, we do it humbly, recognizing that we don't have all the answers and that we haven't answered them ourselves. And so we know that that happens, but it's not my personal job. I'm actually forbidden of operating domestically because of like kind of where I work. And so I get to vote, I get to think about it as a citizen, but from a professional perspective, that's not where I get to sort of focus. And so I don't have a great answer for that because that's not what my specific responsibility is. As far as the training piece, that's squarely my responsibility. So I'm happy to talk about that because that's absolutely my job. And so as Elie Wiesel was passed, they say, okay, we have to train people. Well, how do you do that? And so we had to build a curriculum. And so I contracted out and got some experts to help us build a curriculum, Dr. Wiggum being one of the experts. And we start out with an understanding of what are the basic definitions? What are the atrocity crimes? What is actually means by crimes against humanity? What are the steps that are included there? How did we come to understand what genocide is? What's the history of that term? How did it move through the UN? How did it become something that is known? And so we sort of start with the definitions and the legal underpinnings and the kind of understanding of what the atrocity crimes are. So that's the first block. Then we move into early warning. Because if you're going to actually say you're worried about these things, well, how do you know what to look for? So we talk about how you do analysis. What are you looking for? What tools already exist? Who in the civil society and academic space is doing this work? Where can you go online to find these things? We have a atrocity assessment framework, which talks about what are certain perpetrators, who's available, what are the things that we're looking for, which we share with the students so that they know that this resource exists. So if they're sitting at their desk thinking about their specific country context, they can start to jot down the notes, and it leads you through to, well, hey, these might be some potential perpetrators. These might be the vulnerable communities at risk. This is how some pathways might lead to atrocities. And then the end part, which is incredibly important, is, so what are you going to do about it? What kind of timeline are you working with? What are your options? What are your resiliencies so that you can respond? And so that early warning piece leads to the third module, which is, so what is prevention? And we talk about what is economic prevention, What is diplomatic prevention? How do sanctions play in? How does programming play in? What are the levers available? Where can you work? How do you do atrocity prevention multilaterally? What works in the UN? Who can you reach out to? Who is interested in this? And so we spend a whole long lesson specifically on what is in the toolbox from a United States perspective to respond to atrocities. The next one, we talk about the multilateral kind of fully, and make sure that we understand that if we're talking all hands on deck, if we're realizing that we can't operate as just the State Department or just the United States, that we have to do this collectively, well, what does that mean? How does that happen? Who do you reach out to? Who else cares? Who else is paying attention? Who else is doing work in this space? And so a talk about the international options and available to make sure that we are thinking not just internally, but thinking more broadly. We then talk about transitional justice. Because if you don't do the recovery piece, we don't talk about what is full spectrum justice. Folks don't have that answer. They don't know that if you haven't been trained. So explaining what retributive versus restorative, what full spectrum means, what is memorialization, how does that work, that we spend a whole lesson sort of talking about. We talk about the mechanisms for the ICC and the ICJ. We explain sort of how that prosecution happens. And so we spend a whole lesson on that. And then we do a lesson on how gender plays in, how conflict-related sexual violence plays in. That's taught by my colleagues from the Office on Global Women's Issues, because atrocity affects different populations differently, and to ignore that is to miss out on some of the threats are and some of the response options are. And then at that point, we try to go do a site of conscience, so that let's go see a place and make sure we understand why we're doing this work. On the most recent training I did this summer, we all trekked over to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and they hosted us, and they had a survivor of the Holocaust come speak to us. So it makes it very real for individuals. This is why this work matters. This is how this person's life was affected. This is why this is worth doing. And then the last day is a simulation. During the pandemic, because we were not traveling so much, and because I was doing most of the training virtually, I had some more ability in our congressional earmark to improve our simulation exercise. And so I contracted with a company, and they built a multimedia layered exercise with a fictional country context where individuals are placed into different groups to be able to respond to an ongoing atrocity scenario. And so things start out kind of bad, then they get worse, then they get really bad, and at each of those points, we ask the participants to think of policy options, to think of what would you do if you were at post? What would you do if you were at the NSC? And I think one of the nicest things about the scenario is it's responsive. If they come back with a good idea, if they come back with a response that has a high likelihood of actually affecting things, the situation improves. Too often simulations, I think, sort of have to follow the track of getting to the bad things at the end, and that it sort of demotivates students from thinking through the good options. And so if you come up with some good options, the situation improves. And we have videos, and we have social media injects, and we have news reports, so that it actually feels really tangible and real, and gives the participants the chance to, all right, so you're at a place and things start to go bad, what are you gonna do? And one of the things that we sort of try to drive through home in the training is, you don't have to remember all of this, but you have to remember that there are folks that are thinking about this all the time. And if you start to see some of those red flags, you need to call. You need to send a message. You need to send a cable. You need to reach out so that I can bring the resources I have available and that my colleagues in the task force have available. We can only bring them to bear if we know and if we're engaged. And so the number one thing I want the students to walk away with is, if you see something, say something. If you are identifying risk, get your hand up, make sure that you're reaching back to DC, because we have personnel, we have resources, we have individuals that are thinking about this all the time and want to assist. And so that I want to be able to facilitate that and drive that forward. And so that's what I hope they walk away from. And anecdotally, folks that have gotten trained have then reached back out and been like, hey, I'm seeing some stuff here. And then I'm able to help spread that information around. And then maybe some policy things changed. And so in small ways, I'm actually seeing a return on that investment where folks that are now better informed are bringing good ideas, and then we're able to act on them all the time. Please.
Politics being so divided nowadays, and it's constantly swinging back and
I'm
forth.
sorry, I'm not terribly great at hearing.
Sorry. With politics being so divided nowadays, and it's constantly swinging back and forth, how does that affect your department, or does it at all?
So I'm in one of the places that's actually pretty apolitical. Genocide, bad. It's a pretty clear, nonpartisan issue, and I mean, the LUSL Act, which says we're going to do this, was passed under the last administration, and this administration has continued to support that, and I imagine the ones after. And so there's not actually a whole lot of debate on atrocities being awful. No one in the United States government is advocating for atrocities. And so I happen to be in one of the positions that's incredibly comfortable because it doesn't actually sort of matter all that terribly much. Genocide will always be terrible, and I can continue to work on that.
But
Follow up.
often from genocide, there's refugees, and America doesn't always like refugees, you know, and they don't always want to help them. So that's like where I see it becoming political. Even though genocide is bad, America doesn't always want to do what it takes to help.
Sure, and as I mentioned there, thankfully that's the Bureau of Populations, Refugees, and Migration, and I happen to work in the Human Rights Bureau, and I only have to kind of worry about that. And so I can't speak for the department writ large, I can't speak beyond my own little sort of area of expertise, but for my area, not political. Please.
I don't have a question.
Go.
Hi. In light of the ongoing protests in Iran, and I believe the recent revelation that 300 protesters have died, what is being done to prevent basically atrocities being committed against protesters, and what do you think could be done that hasn't already?
So I'm not going to talk about specific country contexts where I could make things difficult, but I would say that we have a bunch of mechanisms to protect human rights defenders. We have funds, we have the means of doing extraction and things like that for human rights defenders across the globe, and that is something inside of our bureau that we're incredibly protective of, and advocacy for those that are working to improve their condition is something we pay a ton of attention to, and that's something that's near and dear to our hearts and that we are very focused on. And so can't speak to Iran specifically, but as far as just sort of thinking about protesters, statements clearly advocating for that security forces need to allow freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, etc. That's something that we have loudly, and actually even in the Iran context, you can read statements from both the secretary and the spokesperson specifically advocating for protesters should be allowed to protest, and that abuse of them is antithetical to what we believe. Next.
Based on the Myanmar genocide, which was incited by the algorithms in Facebook, how would you say society should adjust based on like our current policies in place and our dependence on the internet? And is it the responsibility of the consumers, the tech companies, or the state to put in what ways to prevent such things from occurring again, and what steps we would take to prevent such things?
So I think the genocide had a bunch of factors. I would argue that the social media storm was an accelerant, but I'm not sure I would label it as like the central crux. I think the identity-based differences, I think the othering, I think the inhumane language used by the population against Rohingya, long before Facebook existed, had a huge part to play as well. That said, we recognize clearly that dangerous speech, that hate speech, and its ability to be used by social media and nefarious using those is incredibly important. Any one of those companies have a service agreement, right, that each individual, and they all have things that say that dangerous, et cetera, is not going to be allowed. We talk regularly with those in industry about how they can do that. We have provided business advisories on how to do that. We are not in the position of the United States of dictating to companies what they can and can't do. That is not sort of how we're built. We can talk, we can suggest, we can engage. I think that's something that does happen. But as far as our ability to simply turn that off, well, when you do that, human rights defenders also don't have the ability to communicate. And those that are providing information out of what's ongoing are not available also. And so shutting off the internet or shutting off an entire network, I'm not sure that that's necessarily always the right answer. I think that amplifying voices that are pushing back, amplifying positive voices, amplifying voices of calm, amplifying voices of those that are looking to build cohesion and to make sure that societies are looking out for one another, pointing out the similarities which greatly outnumber the differences. That's an incredibly important thing and something that we certainly work towards. But to simply tell Meta or tell Google or tell Facebook or tell Twitter or tell whatever that you have to do X, Y, and Z, it's a difficult place to be because of our belief in the First Amendment, things like that. And so,
Would you say it then falls on the consumer itself?
I mean, I would love for consumers to be well informed. I would love for all of us to be better informed and more careful in what we read and to be good consumers of media and to think hard about what you're getting and where is that information coming from. I think collectively, globally, we all should be better consumers and to have a bit of skepticism and to not take things at face value and to not take rhetoric as gospel. It's incredibly important, and I would advocate for that completely. It'd also be really cool if I knew how to make that happen. And if I had a great idea, I mean, I don't know, like, I don't know if it's a teaching, I don't know if it's another course, I don't know what that answer is, but absolutely, I would love for people to look with a critical eye at what they're being fed and to think through that. That's super important, absolutely. I think you're up.
So earlier you mentioned being about your gender lens when approaching housing prevention. I was just wondering, specifically in the work that you do, what does that look like? And while not directly explaining how the situation I ran, but how does that whole situation with politics of women's rights kind of influence the work that you do?
Hugely. I mean, you can't ignore one half of the population and expect that you're sort of addressing things. You can't like. So you have a global pandemic, right? Are men and women affected equally? No. The number of women that lost their livelihoods was greatly higher than men that lost jobs. Globally, those numbers are clear. The ability for women to have political involvement is often predicated on them having economic involvement. And so if that goes away, then you start to lose the ability. Now you have a marginalized population that is being further marginalized. You have to be aware of that, you have to address that. You have to have peace processes where women are advocates. I got to talk to the special advisor on the prevention of genocide, and she's advocating to explain to women peace builders how much atrocity prevention they're already doing, because the work that they're doing is already driving down atrocity risk and making sure that not only are they aware, but that they're proud of the work that they're doing and figuring out how to make it even more efficient and to share information. That's super important. Thinking about how conflict-related sexual violence, gender-based violence, online GBV, digital GBV, how that drives women away from the political sphere and makes it untenable for them to participate, and what that does as far as atrocity risk is super important, because they scare the women off and make them go back. But it's clearly happening in a lot of different situations, and that has to be addressed. How that addresses children and how that balance happens, super important. Rape as a weapon of war, incredibly awful, but happens and is clearly designed to demoralize and to withdraw and to limit populations, and has to be addressed. And clearly, we didn't have a gender as part of the training, and it was an omission. And so worked with the Office of Global Women's Issues to include it, and now it's automatic. I travel with my colleague from SGE. We're going the same places because you can't have one without the other. They have to be tied, and it can't be an afterthought, and it can't be an add-on. It needs to be from inception, and we're not there yet, but we're trying, and we're looking for specific factors. Having conversations with colleagues internationally. The what works thing. What did the UK learn? What are they seeing? What are they figuring out that we can take and use and make better? Because I'm more than happy to steal good answers if somebody else comes up with them. I don't have to be the one to come up with it. Let's figure out the best way as soon as possible. Because none of it happens as fast as I want. Anything that I can get that speed, that quicker, that adoption faster, awesome. Let's figure out how to do that. And had a meeting about conflict-related sexual violence. There's probably 35 people in the meeting. There's one guy. It's me. That's not the right answer either, right? You have to have men as a advocate, as a partner, as a champion to also sort of work this. It cannot be women alone that are advocating. I'm not sure I'm necessarily the poster for who should be the gender lead for but I'm doing a lot of that work because you have to have both, and it has to be a partnership, and it has to be that involvement. So a clear recognition of it's got to be all of us kind of pulling together, and that we have to address 3,000, 4,000 years worth of stuff to sort of get to that place. And so that's super important, and a clear understanding of that work has to happen.
I'm on the other side.
Good, it makes me walk back and forth. So
My name is Chloe, and I study philosophy and anthropology, but over the summer I was actually in the UK studying counterterrorism and crime prevention. And so I was kind of interested in a lot of atrocities occur because of various ideologies that encourage people to dehumanize other groups. And it's notoriously difficult to deal with ideologies that cause people to do bad things. And so how do you kind of put that into these trainings? And how do you, train people to deal with these problems with ideologies that may be really long-held cultural beliefs?
Sure. You got to meet people where they are, right? The idea that you can magically just come in and give them a blueprint and they're going to leap into the new way of thinking is unreasonable. I can't do that. I'm still the victim of things my parents told me that I don't agree with, and yet I still feel my brain go the wrong direction, have to grab it, kind of pull it back and slap it around a little bit and point it in the right direction. It's slow, it's methodical, it takes time. But you make change where you can. You open space where, okay, so now women are allowed to be outside now without a chaperone. Okay, that's a step in the right direction. It's not the fix, but it's moving. I'm trying to win 51%. I'm gonna lose a bunch, but I'm trying to get that slightly better. I'm trying to drive towards a slightly better outcome, thinking that long arc, trying to bend towards the better option and bend towards the better point. And so you fight tooth and nail each time, and you take the wins when you can, and you try to push where you can. If you can sneak the ideological change under something else, hey, if you actually allow women to participate in this is what is going to happen to your GDP, because now you have a whole bunch more folks involved in your economy. Hey, if you do this, then actually you get this whole other option set available for assistance, and we're able to help you in a bunch of other things. But that law, if you pass it, then we're going to have to kind of do a bunch of stuff and take that away. It is the trade, it is the what levers do you have and where can you sort of pull on them when possible. And that means you got to be really agile, and you got to be thinking through, and you got to understand the context well enough to see where the cracks are. That's not easy to do, and that takes time, and that takes cultural understanding, and that takes awareness. It's hard, and people change jobs, and people move around, and you get a brand new person who is brand new and they're gonna do the best they can, but they don't have that tale, they don't have the historical context. That's hard. But that's why you keep kind of cranking along and you keep pushing and you keep sort of seeing where you can. And when you have like the small breakthrough and it goes well, and you laud it and you make sure that everyone like, look at this was great, and you try to use that example for the next thing. And when you take one on the chin and it goes badly, you try to learn from it. You don't necessarily broadcast it as much, but you try to make sure that you're understanding what went wrong and you're trying to do better the next time. It's trench warfare. It's 2 inches, 1 inch back, 2 inches, 1 inch back. But you're just trying to do what you can, when you can, for as long as you can, as much as you can. Please.
So last question, please go ahead.
So you have a background in the military and a military career, and then moved towards the State Department.
Yep.
So going from a career in warfighting, preparation for warfighting, into a career trying to secure human rights abroad, do you think the military career supported the new career, or was an impediment to it in some degree in the ways that you had trained, or was everything no effect one way or the other?
So when I took my oath of office, when I became an officer, I swore to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and basically supported the institution of the United States, right? Not to any individual, not to any person in power, not to any political party, to the institution. I believe that. I actually didn't vote for a really long time when I was active duty because I thought I was supposed to be apolitical, and I believe that was the case because I was supporting the idea. And I think about like the Emma Lazarus poem, you know, give me you're tired, you're hungry, you're yearning to be free. But that's the America that I was pretty sure I was defending, and that was the thing that I was working towards. So I saw absolutely no confrontation with or pushback on human rights in what I was doing. You know, when I responded to an earthquake in Japan, and we were providing humanitarian assistance and providing disaster relief, that felt like we were doing the right thing. When I was working with colleagues in Southeast Asia so that they could do defense of their own areas and take care of their fishing areas and be able better to provide for, that felt to me like the right thing, like we were pushing in the right direction. And so I was never asked to do anything that I thought was morally questionable or reprehensible. I did defense. I was a presence. When I was abroad, it was to make sure that folks knew that we were going to keep the sea lanes open, and we were going to allow commerce to happen, and we were going to protect our partners and work with our partners. I did a lot of my career doing bilateral exercises with good, smart, capable people who happened to wear a slightly different uniform than I did, but ultimately the enemy was the ocean much more than ourselves. The ocean is always trying to kill you. Navies generally are more scared of the water than anything else. And so for me, making the transition to human rights, it's much more specific and it's much more granular, but it in no way felt incongruous with what I had done previously. And what it does is it gives me an understanding of how militaries work. I end up as sort of a bit of a hybrid where I'm kind of state and kind of military, and I have an understanding of both. That's incredibly helpful when I'm talking to folks. I mean, if you think about how big the Department of Defense is, how much we are forward deployed, where we have bases, where we have presence, it has to be a whole of government exercise. DoD has to be a part of how we do atrocity prevention. And it's really helpful for me to be able to talk to folks across the river because I know what offices they're in and I understand what the rank structure is. It gives me a leg up as far as being able to have those conversations, and it gives me an ability to have a bit of credibility and establish some that I'm not just the State Department spouting off. Like, no, I did that for 20 years. Like, I've got the card to prove it. And so that's helpful. I think my military service is only a boon, and it gives me the ability to make decisions. It gives me the ability to kind of understand how to work processes. You know, get an aircraft carrier underway after a 12-month shipyard availability. That's a big problem. We figured out how to do that. I know how to make that happen. Doing a training for 50 people in Johannesburg, that's pretty manageable. I can do that with a decent spreadsheet. And so my ability to kind of do logistics and sort of make that happen, that was all built through my military career and my experience. And so see problem, come up with response, and answer problem, I'm real good at that. That's squarely in my belly. Thank you all so very much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the great questions. Thank you.